please join us. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for staying with us throughout the day. We heard from some very interesting panels this morning about very diverse topics, and we're going to switch gears one more time to focus on electric vehicle supply chain resilience. So this is a topic we've been talking a lot about at the Atlantic Council. In the beginning of this year, US Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo stated that we need to keep an eye out on electric vehicles. And we've been doing just that, and we saw a lot of action both from the EU and the US over the summer in the EV space. That's why it's so exciting that we have representation from both sides of the Atlantic today, and a fantastic lineup of speakers. We have Sarah Bauerle Danzman, Associate Professor of International Studies at Indiana University, also a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Anahita Toms, Partner at Baker McKenzie, and it's our third consecutive year joining us as a speaker at the Transatlantic Forum. Chris Smith, who is the Chief of Government Affairs at Ford Motor Company, and Ambroise Fayol, Vice President of European Investment Bank. I hope I did a nice job with German and French names. My colleagues tried to train me on that. So before we get into the conversation, I wanted to mention that Sarah wrote an excellent report specifically for our forum today and for this conversation. It's about EV supply chain resilience, and if you haven't already seen it in the many, many emails you've been receiving from us since you signed up for this conference, you can access it by scanning QR codes on your badges and read Sarah's report after the conference. So with that, before we even get into the findings of your very unique report, why don't you set the scene for us in terms of what opportunities do electric vehicles create for the energy transition goals, and then what are the main national security and economic competitiveness considerations when it comes to Chinese EVs?
Well, thank you so much, Maya. It's a pleasure to be here for my second time at the Transatlantic Forum, and thank you all for being here as well. I'm really excited to share the stage with three additional panelists who bring a lot to this conversation. So, I mean, of course, you know, at a very basic level, vehicles account for about 25% of global emissions, and so therefore electrifying mobility is a key to achieving net zero. And along with achieving net zero, there's a lot of interest in kind of using the energy transition in order to seed innovation and manufacturing renewal in advanced economies and beyond. But when we start to think about the national security as well as economic competitiveness implications of the EV transition, I would say that it might be helpful to start first with EVs and competitiveness. And in this regard, Ambassador Burns kind of scooped us because this morning he spent quite a bit of time talking about EVs. So those of you who are familiar with kind of industrialization processes know that the auto industry has been a keystone to industrialization trajectories of many economies. Approximately 5% of global manufacturing employment is in this industry. And the auto industry really helped to support a broader industrial ecosystem as countries were transitioning into the industrial age with providing a market for steel and precision engines and other parts and assembly and so forth. So the auto industry is really an essential part of countries' industrial manufacturing base, and China's market size and industrial overcapacity is just so large that the real concern is that they can easily overwhelm nascent EV industries in other economies with ripple effects into the broader economy. The way that this connects to national security is sort of the first order effects of over-reliance on a strategic competitor and systemic rival. For instance, with batteries that have dual use potential, as well as connectedness and charging infrastructure potential, or the connectedness and charging infrastructure that's a part of EVs has a lot of potential for data collection and logistical tampering, which we'll talk about a little bit with the recent proposed rulemaking on connected vehicles. But then there are these broader second order effects that are more in the realm of economic security that have to do with industrial capacity, innovation, employment, and then if there's large decreases in employment, political stability.
That's great. And to stay with you for a few more minutes, so what stood out to me about your report is that it identifies G20 as a platform where this global transition from ICE vehicles to EV should be coordinated. So why did you choose G20 as a platform for that, and how would you choose these very diverse G20 economies to sort of work on that together instead of pursuing their own national security and like industrial policies?
Yeah, so I mean, again, Ambassador Burns scooped us with this, right? So he specifically called out the fact that there are multiple countries that are within the G20 but are not in the G7 who are currently putting in place tariffs on Chinese EVs, right? And are pursuing their own industrial policies around this precisely because of what I just talked about in terms of how important the traditional auto manufacturing industry has been for industrial trajectories of many economies. And so, you know, I don't want to put too kind of rosy a spin on this. I'm not suggesting that the G20 can get together and solve all of these problems, because there are real distributive implications of the road ahead. But what I do think is important is that we spend more time at least in dialogue with each other, if not complete coordination, so that we can find opportunities for when is it possible to work together to find resiliency across these supply chains in ways that do not require kind of countries having complete autonomy in these supply chains, right, and complete self-reliance, but this kind of concept of friendshoring that we're all so pleased was first introduced at the Atlantic Council. You got it, Josh. You can count on me for that. But also to raise concerns with each other, right? Because when, you know, China is also in the G20, right? And so a lot of people would say, well, why would you want to seat this particular kind of coordinating mechanism in a body in which China is a part of? Well, because China is a really important part of the global EV supply chain, and also because a lot of the concerns and challenges that countries within the G20 have with China, they can be more forceful in communicating that if they can communicate that together.
And so we mentioned domestic manufacturing, and here I'd like to bring Chris in. So Ford is number 2 EV manufacturer in the US. So how intensive is the process of building manufacturing equipment for EV for traditional automakers, and what are some of the critical factors that could help US automakers succeed in this transition from ICE to EV?
Yeah, thanks. So that's a big question, right? So Ford, we're a 120-year-old company. So kind of heart of American manufacturing, or origin of mass transportation. And we're now going through a period of change, kind of evolution, of transition that's by far greater than anything the company's gone through. New vehicle design, new ways that we engage with customers, new manners of constructing vehicles, but also the supply chains are entirely different. So if you look from transitioning from traditional vehicles to battery electric vehicles, the supply chain around critical minerals, around lithium, around nickel, around manganese, around graphite, extraction, processing, refining of critical minerals. These are all completely kind of new things for companies like Ford. We went through a real challenging period just now in the pandemic, where we saw how vulnerable supply chains are, primarily through semiconductors and chips. So if you had gone to our main facility in Detroit, where we make the F-150, where years ago we made the Model T. You would have seen, if you were there 100 years ago, you would have seen barges of sand, coming up the river, where we had our own foundries, we made our own glass. All that was done within the company. And over the decades, that's all been disaggregated. So we've got first, second, third tier suppliers that create the components that go into the vehicles. And now we're seeing it's increasingly important to centralize some of that, to have visibility of it, to have some line of sight so that you can understand your supply chain. It's all the more important now because of the reliance of these new critical minerals. So we're putting a lot of effort into that. We're putting a lot of effort into new investments. We have joint ventures that are building battery plants in Kentucky and in Tennessee. We're building our own battery plant in Michigan, 2 different separate battery chemistries. So we're building these greenfield plants for the first time in decades. It's kind of new muscle memory for a company like Ford. But the last thing I'll mention on the topic is that the importance of winning on electric is critical for a company like Ford. Our investment cycles, our business cycles go far beyond any kind of political cycle, any policy cycle. So we have to think about these decadal investments that we're making, multi-billion-dollar investments, where we have to believe in the product, and we have to believe in our ability to understand where markets and customers are going and make big investments based on those observations. So when we look at the 2 platforms and we look at internal combustion engine vehicles versus electric vehicles, it's our belief that not for every duty cycle, but for many, many duty cycles, the companies that win on electric are going to win over the medium and the long term. So really important for companies like Ford.
And thank you for that private sector perspective. Now going to Vice President Ambos. So what's European Investment Bank's role and function in facilitating the production and adoption of electric cars in Europe? And what are some of the steps that the EIB has taken to support Europe's domestic car manufacturers?
Maybe I should start by saying a few words about what the European Investment Bank is, because I guess
that would be
nobody
great.
heard here about EIB. EIB is a public bank. Our shareholders are the member states of the European Union, and we are the financial arm of the European Union. So we finance projects that have a European interest. And we do that for big amounts, around 80 billion euros per year, mostly inside Europe. And of course here we are at the time when we have to implement the strategy that the Europeans have decided in terms of greening the economy and making Europe the first continent to be climate neutral by 2050. And at the same time, the automotive industry in Europe represents 13 million jobs. So this is a combination of green, strong interest of Europeans and also the willingness to remain competitive. So what do we do basically in terms of supporting EV? We do 3 things. We do, which we have done for a long time, supporting research and development programs of big companies. We've done that, for example, for Volvo recently, who wanted to develop an electric vehicle platform that they asked for our support. We provided them with quite significant loan. I have to say that our lending is interesting because we are a AAA institution, so we borrow cheap and long. And since we are public, we make our projects benefit from these good conditions. The second thing we have done is to support the emergence of gigafactories in Europe. And there are now quite a few of them. There is, of course, Northvolt in Sweden, and there are a few in northern France, ACC, Vercors, for example, which have developed based on their links with car makers, but also this was the places where there were previously big car companies that had been giving through difficulties. And actually, these companies, they are often startups or close to startups. So the capital needs are huge, and the risks are also huge. And so this is where a public bank can help. If you want to develop your own electric vehicle standard in Europe. And as you know, we need to do that also because as of 2035, sales of internal combustion engine vehicles will be forbidden in Europe. So we need really to speed up the conversion to electric vehicles. And the last thing we do is in terms of financing the infrastructure, the charging stations. That's where also we need to, or making projects on research and development related to these charging stations. So what we aim at here is to speed up the development of charging stations that are effective, but also that are working the same way throughout Europe, so that it is of an easier use between countries in Europe. So that's basically what we have developed in the recent years.
That sounds, and it's very good that you mentioned the charging infrastructure problem, because my next question is about the challenges and potential solutions for building a resilient and efficient EV supply chain. And I'll start with Sarah and Chris, but I would love to have your comment on that as well, Ambros. Sarah?
Right. Well, want to throw it back to Chris first, since you have the practical experience.
Yeah, sure. So in every major transition that we've had, be it telecommunications or the internet or highways or space travel, there's always been an important catalytic role that governments have played. And we think this is going to be no different. And in the area of kind of charging station infrastructure, I think that's a classic case. One of the challenges that we have in terms of people kind of adopting electric vehicles is the idea about, how am I going to charge when I'm on the road, right? So right now the business models for building charging station companies, it's challenged because the volumes of EVs are going up. It's hard to get the volumes of EVs to go up when people are still concerned about charging. So we've got some government programs, NEVI, which is the North America Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which is a collaboration between the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation, which is looking at putting in or funding using state grants that are managed by states, infrastructure that will create more reliable access to charging infrastructure on highways, on main mobility corridors. So we think programs like that are really important. We're seeing a standardization here in the United States on the charging plug. Like we used to have various plugs, so we're now consolidating towards one plug. And so we think that those are steps that are going to make the process kind of more streamlined and more efficient.
Sarah?
Yeah, I'll just expand. So first of all, I can't wait for that as an EV owner who lives in the Midwest. We need more charging stations. Right. One thing I learned while writing this report is that as much as the US needs more charging stations, if we want to speed up adoption, particularly in kind of more middle income countries, we have an even further road ahead of us. And that's going to create a lot of interesting politics around who gets the procurement contracts to build out that infrastructure, which is one place that the G20 can help to kind of have those conversations around those types of concerns. But the more broader kind of questions about resiliency and efficiency within supply chains in building the EVs themselves. First of all, resiliency and efficiency are sort of opposites, right? So it's about optimizing between those two competing goals. And I think one thing that we really found as we were digging into the kind of disaggregated trade data for the report is that if you focus on one part of the EV supply chain and try to build out more resilience, especially kind of thinking about that in terms of more different sources, right? That if you do that in isolation without looking further up the like upstream, you might actually end up concentrating your risk without realizing that. So that's one thing that we've seen, is that as there's been a lot of work to try to expand beyond China sources for especially battery components, you can see that Japan is gaining ground. But then if you go upstream, you see that Japan is just as reliant as they've ever been on China to process the critical minerals that go into those batteries. So we just have to be thinking holistically about the entire supply chain instead of getting focused on the kind of each step in the process and only kind of working on building out resiliency there. So it really is, Chris mentioned, second tier, third tier, even fourth tier suppliers, and really understanding the risks associated with that, and who is relying on who at each stage is really important.
Definitely. And Abbas, would you agree with Sarah's assessment? Thank you.
Much more succinct than me.
Well, we can bring Anahita then quicker in the conversation. So at the beginning, I mentioned tariffs, and that has been happening and has been a topic of conversation throughout the whole year. In May, we saw tariffs by the Biden administration. In July, by the EU, the provisional tariffs on Chinese EVs. So obviously, there is this movement towards helping domestic manufacturing and industry. So how do current industrial policies impact the resilience of the EV supply chain?
It definitely impacts it significantly. And I would highlight 3 areas. It's not just production, but also, you mentioned tariffs, trade, and that's not just tariffs, but also export controls. You mentioned, Sarah, dual-use goods. And then the third thing that rarely is mentioned in this discussion is foreign direct investment restrictions, what you call in the US CFIUS. We have the same in Germany as well, and we have an EU framework in relation to foreign direct investment restrictions. So all these areas definitely impact innovation, but also collaboration cross-border. So we do see that many companies are looking for subsidies on the one hand, on the other hand are looking at the competition all the time, and what is the competition doing. At the same time, the tariffs and all the trade wars that we are seeing obviously impact companies, because companies are rarely only German or US, they are international by now. And every tariff somewhere will hit the company abroad.
Yeah, and actually, if we could open up that discussion to the whole panel. So at the Economic Statecraft Initiative, we think a lot about the unintended consequences of using economic statecraft tools like sanctions, export controls, investment screening, as you mentioned. So what are some of the unintended consequences of using these tools in the EV space? So.
Well, I mean, the tools have a role, right? And we, you talked a little bit about the overcapacity issue in China. Chinese electric vehicles now being very, very competent, by the way, very good, and coming down in price. But there are there's some reasons behind that, right? Many of the standards are different. The environmental standards are different. There's labor standard issues, and there's also the fact that the government is supporting these companies in ways that is probably not going to be sustainable over time, but which is also creating this level of overcapacity. So in the immediate term, there's going to be, I expect governments to react in ways that will endeavor to level the playing field in order for countries to protect their home markets. I'm not in government. I work for a car company, so I won't opine on what governments do. But I know that over the long term, as we think about the way that we deploy capital, the way we design vehicles, the way that we engage with our customers, we have to win on the product, right? And as you mentioned, we are a global company. We're an American company. about half of our market is the United States, about half of our market is international, about half of our workforce is in the United States, about half of our workforce. Manufacturing otherwise is international. So regardless of what happens here, we're competing in a broader world. And there's no way we can endeavor to control or influence all of that. So in the end, innovation and the product and the competencies and the capabilities and our ability to understand what customers want is the thing that we're going to have to focus on while we see kind of this evolving kind of political and policy landscape.
Sarah?
I'll just add that global firms make global supply chain decisions and investments, and that has to be based off of long-term strategy. And so kind of my concern about some of these tools is just that the more that you introduce kind of uncertainty into that process, the harder it is for firms to make good decisions over the long term about how to organize their supply chains.
Yeah, was?
Well, to me, the big difference is short-term versus long-term. Frankly speaking, this is not completely surprising, given the importance of this industry for the competitiveness of your territory, and in my case, the European territory, that the public authorities are making subsidies to develop this industry. And that's what we have done in Europe, a combination of subsidies and loans. And now, to me, the bigger problem is more if it lasts. If it's to go from a transition from what we had to the new system. Personally, I don't see that much of unintended consequences, but timing is of the essence. If I may add, it's not an unintended consequence, but to me, one of the biggest challenges is on skills. How do we keep the skills of those workers who will have to make the transition from the previous way of making cars to the new one? That is a big challenge to me.
All right, and before we move into our next question, I want to remind the audience that we are taking questions. So on your badges, you have QR codes where there is Q&A function. We already have some questions, but I also wanted to remind the in-person audience about that. So coming back to Anahita, so you have the legal perspective on this panel. You work with companies a lot and advising sort of how to navigate this space. And in light of the increasing focus on ESG criteria, how can companies in the EV supply chain navigate the complexities of regulatory compliance while still advancing green initiatives?
So as multinational companies, of course, the first thing that a lawyer would do is say to which jurisdiction applies to that company. And very often we do see it's US laws, it's EU laws, it's laws in Mexico. So I think it's a very broad range of laws that apply to you. And not all of them obviously have the same industrial policy behind them. So some of them may even conflict. When we look at, for example, sanctions and then anti-boycott laws, we do see that they may not go the same direction. Or if you look at the German Supply Chain Act, which has been complemented by the CSDDD, which is the EU equivalent to the German Supply Chain Act, which focuses on human rights in the supply chain as well as environmental issues in the supply chain. And then you look at the US equivalent, the UFLPA that you are aware of, they work very differently. So whereas the German and the EU law work very much towards a risk-based approach and has very concrete expectations regarding your policies, training, and human rights officers being appointed, et cetera, the US law more works towards this is the region we are focusing on, and these are the companies we're working on. So what I want to say with that is, you as a multinational company, you have to understand the laws, obviously, but then you have to navigate yourself, looking at the different jurisdictions and to see how can you, with the limited workforce you have, make sure that you comply with the laws, and ideally make sure that you use the opportunities that come with a resilient and sustainable company.
All right. Speaking of companies navigating the EV space, Chris, we saw some news from August that Ford changed its EV plans to focus more on hybrids and affordability. Not very directly related, but still. So in your view, what are the key barriers to the EV growth in the US, and what are the main concerns of American consumers regarding electric vehicles?
Yeah, so I'd challenge the characterization of that as a shift, really. So that news cycle involved the delay of a vehicle that we're making in Tennessee, which is going to be the next flagship electric vehicle that Ford's going to produce. There's many things that go into how we think about major vehicle launches. It's the development of the vehicle itself. It's all the infrastructure that goes around the vehicle. It's also consumer demand, and you have to line those things up. So for something that's so incredibly important for the company, it's critical that we kind of get that right. So that was kind of what that particular segment was about. However, it does highlight something that's really important that gets to the heart of your question, which is how do we think about transitions for a company that has to invest billions and billions of dollars in a way that has to be ahead of wherever the market is going. Because the time cycle between an idea, a concept, engineering, design, approval, creating the plants, putting the vehicle on the road, that's a multi-year process. So you start it here, trying to understand where the consumer is going to go. So right now, the electric volumes are still increasing. They're still increasing fast. They're not increasing quite as fast as we thought they were going to increase a couple of years ago. So some of the growth is slowing down. And so that's causing us to think about how do we make sure that our investments are meeting the needs of the customers. But over time, we understand that this is the direction that the company's heading. It's still the major investments that we're making in electric. It's not going to be for all customers immediately, but we do still very believe in the business model.
All right. And Amboas, if I may ask you, we already touched on this, but so where do you see opportunities for working with allies on building a resilient EV supply chain?
I see that in a few areas, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
One is diversification in the supply of credit of raw materials, critical raw materials, where we all need with our allies to increase the security of supply, and that's something where we certainly could work with countries like Australia or Canada or Chile or a few others. Where we could also have some common interest, I think, is in creating or developing innovation hub that would really specialize in electric vehicle supply chain. You see the technologies are really interesting in countries like here, in the US, in Japan, in a few other countries. For me, this would be also a natural way of developing opportunities together. You could also think of how to make, back to the question of infrastructure, how can we make a more convenient use of the infrastructure? Here, probably there are opportunities to work together to try to do that better together in between allies. So there are a few areas where I hope there are opportunities to work together.
All right, and we have one interesting question from the audience from Alexander Maki. So please speak to the strategy of electrifying individual vehicles versus public transportation, as it seems this would be especially key for replication in middle-income countries.
Yeah, I can talk a bit to that. So we're focused on individual vehicles. So we're not in the business of public transport. However, an important part of that strategy is the issue of commercial vehicles. And so those aren't vehicles that those are vehicles that people work in, larger vehicles, vans, et cetera. So getting to vehicles that are kind of to your larger class of vehicles, there's going to be some challenges with the current state of battery technology just because of the weight of the battery and the weight of the vehicle. But we do see lots of applications for that kind of middle transportation space, large vans, et cetera. So that's the space that Ford is working on.
Would you comment on that, Ambulance or Sarah?
Well, what I think is this is. I mean, you don't need to choose between developing individual EVs and collective green buses. That's what we try to do. This is a choice that we absolutely do not want to do. The best we can do is to try to support both, and that's what we do. We support individual EVs, for example, in supporting the gigafactories that are producing those, and we support the local authorities, actually in Europe but also outside Europe, even in developing countries, when there is an interest for them to develop green transport, and that goes with the fact that in many cities now, in Europe in particular, you have the no use of other than electric vehicles or very low carbon use of vehicles that force also the local authorities to move and to transition from the previous system to the electric vehicles one, or hydrogen ones, or low carbon one, basically. And that's something that as a banker and as trying to defend the interest of the European Union, we love to finance actually.
All right, and to sort of go into the emerging markets where we've actually started at the beginning. We have countries such as Brazil, India, Indonesia, and many of these economies have already attracted Chinese FDI. And Chinese companies are involved at different stages of production in the EV process in these countries. So do you think the fact that China sort of moved in there first, developed relationships, do you think that will somehow get in the way of US and European companies of going in and developing those economic relationships with emerging markets in the EV space?
I mean, I can touch on that. I mean, I mentioned the battery plants that we are constructing in the United States. We have joint ventures building NCM nickel, cobalt, manganese battery plants in Kentucky and in Tennessee. And we're building a lithium iron phosphate plant, which is a Ford plant in Michigan. The technical service provider for that plant is CATL, which is a Chinese company. It's the best battery maker in the world right now. Billions of dollars, much of state subsidized money that's gone into building that capability. But right now we live in a world that has these linkages, right? As you mentioned, you've got Chinese and other types of investments that are throughout the world. They're in different places. So as we look to de-risk our supply chain, as Ford gets more engaged in making sure that we understand the standards that are being used to extract and produce and refine all the minerals that we have, by looking at different places geographically in the world and not centering ourselves in one place, we're helping to diffuse some of that risk to make sure that our supply chain is more transparent. But also, in that one is concerned about environmental issues or labor issues or any other such concerns, the transparency and the visibility that one gets through a public brand like Ford being engaged is something that can be a force to move these things in the right direction. We have one single set of standards, whether we are procuring minerals in one country or another. We can't go to a place where we say, hey, here's a cheaper supply, but the standards don't meet our standards, because our customers are going to hold us accountable. So we're sort of a new type of customer for these large-scale critical mineral facilities, which we think will move all of these facilities towards better, more sustainable standards.
Sarah?
I don't have too much to add here other than just that I do think that there are kind of questions that U.S. government needs to answer for firms all over the world about kind of how much are we going to allow components of the EV supply chain have connections to a China nexus at all. You know, we have this new notice of proposed rulemaking on connected vehicles that now, once it is enacted, will prevent cars that are sold in the U.S. from having Chinese components in certain types of its hardware and software systems. And so that will mean that if a car company in a third country is, you know, creating a supply chain that relies on this Chinese hardware or software, that it wouldn't be able to be exported to the U.S. And I think that one thing that the U.S. really has going for us is that our car market, I mean, not to China, but to others, is still open, right? And I think it's quite clear now that the China market is not really going to open to car imports. So those market forces do help to pull more allies and partners into our orbit, but kind of understanding how much extraterritorial reach our regulations are going to have in terms of requiring certain kinds of supply chain configurations will matter for how other countries continue to think about the U.S. market and whether it makes sense to organize their industries in order to continue to have access.
All right, Anahita?
I think we have to be very realistic about what companies can achieve and what regions can achieve. If you look at the CHIPS Act in the European Union and the Critical Raw Material Acts in the European Union, even if we are able to utilize these laws, they reduce our dependency maximum by 10%. So if we look at such a number, we realize that yes, industrial policies make a difference and raise awareness and lead us to a certain direction, but some factual circumstances limit the possibilities. So even if we don't look at too much to efficiency and costs, some things like rare earth, at the moment, the dependency is challenging to reduce. And while there are, of course, some initiatives in certain countries which give us hope that we can reduce further the dependency, I think one thing that we should also mention today is we talk a lot about diversification. We talk less about digitalization. So I think that's the basis of everything that we have been discussing today, because that is something where we are not dependent, should not be dependent. And we have seen during COVID how little digitalized we were. So I think that is, of course, a topic of itself on how to do that properly. But diversification is one thing, regionalization is one thing, but digitalization is something that, of course, has to be top of our mind if we look at some of the products that can only be recycled to a certain extent efficiently. And the last thing that I would say is recycling and circular economy is, of course, something that needs to be mentioned in this panel as well as a key topic to make sure that, you know, the dependency is reduced.
Absolutely. Was?
I would just like to react to what you said, because you're right. The example of the CHIPS Act is a very good one. It is true that the CHIPS Act that has been decided in Europe will reduce only marginally the dependency in Europe. At the same time, this is a momentum. And this is a movement that we hope, with the financing that goes with it, is going to create opportunities in Europe to do much more in the chip industry. And that's what actually we are starting to see in countries like Italy, for example. So I hope that this is the kind of political decisions that on the long term do have an impact, and not a marginal one. And I agree completely on circular economy.
Well, on that agreement, we're actually right at time. So thank you very much for this panel, and for this very interesting conversation on a very timely topic. We'll actually close it out right now. But yeah, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.